We are back here on the Lynne Hayes Freeland Show. My guest today is Jerry Dickinson. He is a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. But that's not what we're talking about today. We are actually combining a chunk of Jerry's life, his experiences in South Africa, his run for office here in Pittsburgh, and the unusual perception of the similarities that actually led him to write a piece that looks at Pittsburgh as America's apartheid city. Let's just go back because I would like to assume that everybody watching today read the piece, but they can still go back and read it online. It was like about 2 weeks ago? Is that about right? About 2 weeks ago? And they can still go back and read it online.
Yeah, they can. Yep, the public source, and it's a commentary that was published.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So now when you talk about this segregated life, this segregated lifestyle, the implications of that segregation are significant because that then affects everything from the educational system to what?
Sure. It affects everything from health outcomes to education to housing and occupation and income. I mean, it affects almost every single aspect of American life, segregation. And just like segregation in Johannesburg, here in Pittsburgh, we've had a long history of segregated practices by the city and private actors. So I'll give you an example here. The Lower Hill District in the 1950s and 1960s, the use of eminent domain to displace and raise predominantly African-American community, which effectively pushed thousands, almost upwards to 8,000 residents and dispersed them across the city, many of them going to public housing projects, segregating African-Americans into public housing projects. That was the result of a practice and a policy by the city of Pittsburgh, by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. That's one example. Displacement in East Liberty, so urban renewal in East Liberty, which just carved out and cut out neighborhoods in the social fabric of an African-American neighborhood, again, segregating a part of the city as a result of that. Redlining, where the realtors and real estate agents effectively steered African-American families away from white neighborhoods and pushed them into predominantly Black neighborhoods, thus creating resegregation throughout the city into places such as Homewood, Larimer, Lincoln. That racial steering had a disproportionate impact on segregating the entire landscape in Pittsburgh. On education, long history of discriminatory practices in Rankin and Braddock. Long history of segregation in those school districts that separated Black children from white children. That was happening here in our hometown, in the Black suburbs of Pittsburgh. And then you have exclusionary zoning. So zoning laws that effectively separated homeowners from renters, which in many ways is a de facto racial zoning type of policy. All these policies taken together have effectively created a segregated landscape throughout Pittsburgh. And as a result of that, what we see over the decades is a significant number of racial disparities that result from that segregation in health, occupational outcome, education, housing, and other such things. And that's what really makes Pittsburgh this apartheid city. It's not just the segregation, it's the racial disparities that exist across the segregated landscape.
So then when you break it down, for example, you can take any of these communities that you describe, isolate them and say, for example, cut off public transportation. So if you eliminate public transportation to, especially when you get outside of the city in a Rankin or something like that, if you eliminate the public transportation, then you have, for many of the people who live in those communities, no access to anything, whether it's work, food, medical care. You have no access to anything.
Yes, absolutely. Transportation is a long history of this kind of segregated practices. And you look at places like Johannesburg, South Africa in the same way. And when you cut off forms of transportation to get into certain communities, again, you cut off opportunities for upward mobility, you cut off opportunities for educational opportunities, you cut off opportunities for greater job opportunities, which only then increases and expands the gap that we see in occupational segregation, for example, in all the city of Pittsburgh, or educational outcomes, or even health outcomes as well. If you can't get access to adequate health care as a result of not having access to transportation or being segregated in these neighborhoods, you're going to see vast disparities between whites and blacks in terms of their health outcomes. And that's what we see here in Pittsburgh. The Gender Equity Report shed light on these disparities, and these disparities exist precisely because of this segregated landscape.
Now, here's where my frustration comes in. Because when you break it down like this, it seems to me that the powers that be, whoever those powers are, the powers that be, this should be obvious. These issues, they didn't happen overnight. They have been in existence for a long period of time. These situations didn't happen overnight. Why haven't we begun to address them? I mean, even a lot of the issues in South Africa, some of them have been addressed.
Yes, they have been addressed. Although, it's still one of the most, again, unequal societies, but certainly has been addressed far more than it has here in Pittsburgh. And part of the problem is that many of those practices in the past, those were affirmative actions by politicians to actually create a segregated landscape. In the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s here in Pittsburgh, these were purposeful, intentional actions by public officials to actually segregate the city of Pittsburgh. Today, we don't necessarily see as much of this intentional action on the part of public officials. What we see is an omission, not doing something, inaction by politicians to actually rectify these problems. They exist, and many elected officials at the state, local, and federal levels simply are unwilling to acknowledge it. Why? Because in many ways, it's politically vulnerable for politicians to say, this is how bad this city is in terms of its health and educational and occupational outcomes for African Americans. And as a result of that, many politicians have been hands off. They don't want to talk about the issue. But the reality of it is that from a public policy standpoint, you can't hide from what is obvious here in Pittsburgh, that we are America's apartheid city.
So then along comes Jerry Dickinson and writes this commentary. And I'm curious, have you heard from any elected officials since you wrote this article?
No.
Not a word, not a peep.
No.
Not even a voice of outrage that you would even compare Pittsburgh to.
I have heard from one elected official, and that is Councilwoman Liv Bennett, who's a good friend of mine, who reached out to me. She is a strong advocate for racial justice. She's someone who is implementing policies on a daily basis to try and make Pittsburgh a better place for all. But she's the only elected official who's reached out to me to have a conversation about this essay. Otherwise, most all politicians haven't said a word. Now, that doesn't mean they're having conversations about it behind closed doors, perhaps, but no one's reached out to me to have that conversation, which is unfortunate given the reality that we see here in Pittsburgh.
Well, I was going to say, not only given the reality, but this is also, I mean, it's not like a presidential year, but it's still an election year. I mean, we're in that time of year where there are a lot of people running for various offices. And so I guess my other question is, let's do this. Let's take a commercial break, then we'll come back and I'll go down this road. You're watching the Lynne Hayes Freeland Show. I'm glad you're with us today. And I'm thinking you're glad you tuned in as well. We'll be right back.